Blood streamed down Marcus Wilson's face as Officer Brennan towered over him, knuckles raw. The courtroom fell silent. Marcus slowly reached into his pocket, retrieving not a handkerchief, but a federal judge's badge. "Officer Brennan," he said quietly, "you're under arrest. Before we dive into this shocking story of justice, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see how this power-hungry officer suddenly found himself facing the very authority he tried to abuse." The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, interrupting Marcus Wilson's preparation for a high-profile civil rights case he'd been working on for months. The president's voice was warm but formal as he offered Marcus the position of federal judge for the Northern District of Georgia. At 48, Marcus had spent 2 decades fighting for justice in Atlanta's courtrooms, building a reputation as a brilliant attorney who never backed down from challenging systemic racism in the legal system. The appointment wasn't entirely unexpected. Marcus's name had been on the short list for months, but the reality of it still left him momentarily speechless. As he hung up the phone, memories flooded back of his childhood in South Atlanta, growing up in a neighborhood where segregation might have been officially over, but its shadow lingered in every aspect of daily life. He remembered his father, a postal worker who read law books at night, dreaming of a justice system that would truly serve everyone equally. Marcus had carried that dream through college, where he was often the only black student in his pre-law classes, and then through Harvard Law, where professors regularly mistook him for janitorial staff. Even after graduating with honors, law firms had questioned his qualifications, with one partner candidly telling him they already had their diversity hire. Marcus had proven them all wrong, building a private practice that specialized in civil rights cases and earning a reputation that eventually made even his harshest critics acknowledge his legal brilliance. When he arrived home that evening to his 2-story house in a comfortable Atlanta suburb, his wife Tanya, a hospital administrator, immediately sensed something had changed. Their teenage children, Jamal and Aisha, were squabbling over the remote control in the living room when Marcus made the announcement. The celebration that followed was joyful but tinged with Tanya's concern. "They're not all going to welcome you with open arms," she warned later that night as they lay in bed. "The old guard doesn't give up power easily." Marcus nodded, thinking of his mentor, Judge Howard Thompson, the first black judge appointed to the district in the 1980s. Thompson had received death threats, had a brick thrown through his home window, and faced constant challenges to his authority from attorneys and court staff alike. 2 days later, Marcus met with Chief Judge Patricia Reynolds, a stern but fair woman in her 60s, for a private dinner. Over salmon and asparagus, she outlined the challenges awaiting him. "Most of the staff will be professional," she said, swirling her wine thoughtfully, "but there are pockets of resistance you should be aware of." She mentioned several names, but emphasized one in particular. Captain Richard Brennan, the head of court security. "He's been with the court for 20 years, former police officer. His record is complicated. There have been complaints, but nothing that ever stuck." Reynolds didn't elaborate further, but her expression conveyed volumes. That night, Marcus made a decision that would alter the course of his judgeship before it officially began. He would visit the courthouse incognito, dressed in casual clothes rather than his customary tailored suit, to observe its operations firsthand. "I need to see how people really behave when they don't know who's watching," he explained to Tanya, who looked dubious but understood. The following morning, Marcus donned jeans, a plain button-down shirt, and the Atlanta Falcons cap his son had given him for his birthday. As he approached the imposing federal courthouse, he felt strangely vulnerable without the armor of his professional attire. Entering through the public entrance, he joined the line of citizens waiting to pass through security. That's when he first saw Officer Brennan, a stocky white man with close-cropped gray hair and a permanent scowl, directing people through the metal detectors with sharp, impatient gestures. When Brennan's gaze landed on Marcus, Something in his expression shifted, a barely perceptible hardening that sent a chill of recognition through Marcus. He'd seen that look countless times before. The immediate categorization, the instant suspicion that came with his skin color. Marcus took a deep breath and moved forward in line, already certain that his instinct to come incognito had been correct. The security line moved at an uneven pace, with Officer Brennan spending mere seconds on some visitors while subjecting others to intense scrutiny. Marcus noticed the pattern immediately. White attorneys in suits breezed through with a friendly nod, while black visitors, regardless of their attire, faced additional questions, bag searches, and occasionally the indignity of the handheld metal detector waved uncomfortably close to their bodies. An elderly black woman was made to empty her purse completely when the metal detector beeped, likely from her metal hip replacement, while a white businessman whose watch had triggered the same alarm was waved through with a casual, "No problem, sir." When Marcus finally reached the front of the line, Brennan's demeanor shifted from bored efficiency to focused attention. "ID," he barked, not making eye contact. Marcus handed over his driver's license, which Brennan examined with exaggerated care, turning it over multiple times and holding it up to the light. "Purpose of your visit today?" he demanded, still scrutinizing the ID as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. "I'm here to observe some proceedings," Marcus replied evenly. "Professional interest." Brennan's eyes narrowed. What kind of professional interest would that be? His tone implied that Marcus couldn't possibly have legitimate business in a federal courthouse. "I work in the legal field," Marcus said, simply choosing not to reveal his specific role or new appointment. "Uh-huh." Brennan responded, clearly unconvinced. "Empty your pockets completely and remove your shoes." Marcus complied while noting that none of the three white men who had passed through before him had been asked to remove their shoes. As he placed his wallet, keys, and phone in the plastic bin, Brennan continued his interrogation. "Which courtroom you headed to?" Marcus named Judge Reynolds's courtroom, knowing she was hearing motions that morning. "And you know the defendant, I'm guessing?" Brennan's implication was clear. He assumed Marcus must be connected to someone on trial. "No," Marcus replied calmly. "As I said, professional interest." Brennan made a show of examining Marcus's driver's license again. "There seems to be an issue with this ID," he announced loudly enough for others in line to hear. "Step aside for additional screening." Marcus remained calm but firm. "What issue specifically, then?" he asked. "I've had this license for years with no problems." Brennan ignored the question, pointing to a small area beside the checkpoint. "Wait over there." While Marcus stood waiting, he observed Brennan process 5 more visitors, 3 white and 2 black. The white visitors sailed through without incident, while both black visitors received additional scrutiny, though not as much as Marcus had. After nearly 15 minutes, Marcus spoke up. "Excuse me, Officer Brennan. Is there a problem with my identification? I have other forms if needed." Brennan approached with a scowl. "How'd you know my name?" "You been here before, had trouble?" Marcus pointed calmly to the name badge on Brennan's uniform. "It's on your badge, sir, and no, I haven't had any previous issues." Brennan's face flushed slightly at the oversight. "Listen, we have procedures here. You don't like how we do things, you can take it up with the judge." He gestured toward a white visitor who had just passed through without removing his jacket. "Why aren't you asking him to go through additional screening? His jacket could easily conceal something." The moment the words left Marcus's mouth, he saw Brennan's expression darken dangerously. "You playing the race card on me? Is that what's happening here?" His voice rose, drawing attention from other security officers and people in line. "I'm simply asking for consistent application of security protocols," Marcus replied, keeping his voice level. "I'm here on official business." This statement, though technically true, was a miscalculation. Brennan's face contorted with anger. "Official business? You expect me to believe that—" He leaned closer, voice lowered but intense. "Let me guess. You're here to support your homeboy on trial, but you're trying to sound important." Marcus felt a cold anger rise within him, but maintained his composure. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor, please." Brennan's hand shot out, gripping Marcus's upper arm with unnecessary force. "You're being detained for security verification." Marcus noticed several things simultaneously, the other security officers watching uncomfortably, but making no move to intervene. The stares of people in line, some concerned, others seemingly vindicated in their assumptions, and a young black woman at a nearby clerk's desk who was looking at him with shocked recognition. She was Desiree Jackson, a law clerk he'd met during his orientation tour the previous week. Marcus gave her a subtle headshake, silently asking her not to reveal his identity. This was no longer about his incognito observation. It had become something far more serious. "On what grounds am I being detained?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the authority he'd developed over decades in courtrooms. "Suspicious behavior and possible fraudulent identification." Brennan snapped, tightening his grip painfully on Marcus's arm. "We've had people try to smuggle things in for defendants before." He began pulling Marcus toward a door marked "Security," calling over his shoulder, "Jenkins, I need backup for a combative subject." Marcus didn't resist, physically aware that escalation would only play into Brennan's hands, but he did state clearly, "I am not being combative and I do not consent to this detention." As Brennan dragged him toward the security room, Marcus caught Desiree's eye again. She was already reaching for her phone, her expression a mix of outrage and determination. The last thing Marcus saw before being pulled through the door was the line of courthouse visitors watching the spectacle, some with concern, others with indifference, and a few with the satisfied expression of people seeing their prejudices confirmed. The security holding room was small and windowless, with stark fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across the institutional beige walls. A single metal table was bolted to the floor in the center, flanked by two uncomfortable-looking chairs. A security camera hung in one corner, its red light indicating it was operational, though Marcus noticed the lens was pointed at an odd angle, as if deliberately misaligned. Officer Brennan released his grip on Marcus's arm with a rough shove that sent him stumbling forward. "Sit down," Brennan ordered, his voice thick with barely contained hostility. Marcus rubbed his arm where Brennan's fingers had dug in deep enough to leave marks. He remained standing, maintaining eye contact with the officer. "I'd prefer to stand until you explain why I'm being detained." Brennan's face flushed darker. "You people always gotta make things difficult, don't you?" The racist undertone was unmistakable. "I'm simply exercising my rights," Marcus responded evenly. "There's no legal basis for this detention." Brennan moved closer, using his slightly taller frame to loom over Marcus. "Rights. Let me tell you something about rights in my security area. I decide who's a threat, and right now your attitude is making you look like a real problem." Marcus noticed the door hadn't fully closed behind them. It remained cracked open, about 2 inches. Through the gap, he caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was listening. "Officer Brennan," Marcus said calmly, "I understand you're doing your job, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I've identified myself, explained my purpose here, and cooperated with all reasonable requests. I'd like to speak with your supervisor now." Brennan snorted derisively. "Supervisor? You think you're at the customer service desk at Walmart. This is federal courthouse security." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a near whisper. "You uppity niggers think you can just walk in anywhere these days, demand special treatment." Marcus felt a cold wave of anger, but kept his expression neutral, now absolutely certain that documenting this encounter was essential. "I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that slur, Officer Brennan, but I will be filing a formal complaint about your conduct today." Through the cracked door, Marcus saw a flash of movement again. Desiree had positioned herself nearby, her phone likely recording the exchange. Brennan began pacing the small room like a caged animal. File whatever you want. Know how many complaints I've had? Dozens. Know how many stuck? Zero. He smiled unpleasantly. Nobody believes troublemakers like you over a decorated officer with 20 years of service. He gestured dismissively at Marcus. Probably got a record yourself. That's usually how it is with you people coming in here with an attitude. Marcus remained silent, letting Brennan continue his racist tirade, each word digging the officer deeper into a hole of his own making. "Let me see your ID again," Brennan suddenly demanded. "I think we need to run a real check on you." Marcus slowly reached for his wallet. "My ID is legitimate, as I've told you repeatedly." Brennan snatched the license from Marcus's hand. "We'll see about that. Bet there's warrants out on you. That would explain the attitude, wouldn't it?" He examined the license again, then looked up with a triumphant expression. "Address doesn't match what you told me earlier." Marcus frowned. "I never stated my address to you, Officer Brennan." "You calling me a liar now?" Brennan's voice rose sharply. "That's typical. Always the victim, never taking responsibility." Marcus took a slow, deliberate breath. "I'd like to see the name on your badge again, to ensure I have it correctly for my complaint." He took a small step forward, making no threatening moves, simply trying to read the name badge that Brennan had partially covered with his hand. "That's it!" Brennan exploded. "You don't move unless I tell you to move." What happened next occurred so quickly that Marcus had no time to react. Brennan lunged forward, his right fist connecting solidly with Marcus's nose. The impact was explosive. A burst of pain followed by the immediate rush of warm blood cascading down Marcus's face. The force knocked Marcus backward against the wall as blood spattered onto his shirt. From the doorway came a shocked gasp. Desiree had witnessed the assault. Brennan whirled toward the sound, momentarily panicked at being caught, then immediately shifted to justification mode. "He came at me," he shouted. "Everyone saw it. He tried to grab my weapon." Marcus steadied himself against the wall, blood streaming between the fingers of the hand he'd raised to his shattered nose. Despite the pain radiating through his face, his mind remained crystal clear. This was no longer about observing courthouse operations. This had become a critical moment that would define his tenure as a judge. Through the blood and pain, Marcus heard rapid footsteps approaching. James Willis, the court administrator, appeared in the doorway, his face registering shock at the scene before him. "What the hell happened here?" Willis demanded, looking from Brennan to Marcus with horror. "This man attacked me." Brennan insisted, his voice high with defensive energy. He was being detained for suspicious behavior and possible false identification when he became violent. "I defended myself." Willis turned to Marcus, who was still stemming the flow of blood with his hand. "Sir, are you all right? We need to get you medical attention." Marcus straightened himself with dignity despite the blood continuing to drip onto his shirt. With his free hand, he reached slowly into his back pocket and removed a small leather wallet, different from the one containing his driver's license. He flipped it open, revealing a federal judicial identification card with his photograph and credentials. "My name is Marcus Wilson," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "I'm the newly appointed federal judge for the Northern District of Georgia, and Officer Brennan has just committed assault against a federal official." The room fell into absolute silence, broken only by the sound of blood dripping onto the tile floor. Brennan's face drained of all color as he stared at the judicial credentials, the magnitude of his error dawning on him with horrifying clarity. Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their authority only to have it backfire spectacularly? Comment number 1 if you believe Officer Brennan deserves to lose his job for this assault, or number 2 if you think there might be extenuating circumstances we haven't seen yet. Like and subscribe to follow Marcus's journey for justice in a system where he now holds power. What would you do if you were in Marcus's position? Would you seek immediate revenge or play the long game for justice? Keep watching to see how our new judge handles this explosive situation. The news of what had happened in the security holding room spread through the courthouse with the speed and force of a shockwave, creating ripples of disbelief, outrage, and in some corners quiet satisfaction that someone had finally exposed what many had long suspected about Officer Brennan's conduct. Chief Judge Patricia Reynolds burst through the doors of the medical room where a court-appointed physician was examining Marcus's broken nose, her normally composed face flushed with a mixture of anger and mortification. "Judge Wilson, I cannot begin to express how horrified I am," she said, watching, as the doctor gently cleaned the dried blood from Marcus's face. "This is inexcusable, absolutely inexcusable." Outside in the hallway, raised voices could be heard. Brennan was loudly proclaiming his innocence, insisting that Marcus had made a threatening move toward him. "He's claiming self-defense," Reynolds said with disgust. "Says you lunged at him." Before Marcus could respond, Desiree Jackson stepped forward from where she had been quietly waiting in the corner of the room. "I have audio evidence that contradicts Officer Brennan's claims," she said, holding up her smartphone. "I recorded most of their interaction when I realized something was wrong." The young clerk looked nervous but determined. "He used racial slurs and was aggressive from the start. Judge Wilson never threatened him in any way." Reynolds's eyebrows shot up, and she turned to Marcus with a questioning look. "I wanted to observe the courthouse operations without the filter of my position," Marcus explained, wincing as the doctor applied a numbing agent to his nose, "to see how things really work when people don't know they're being watched by a judge." Reynolds nodded slowly, understanding dawning on her face. "And you found exactly what you were concerned about." It wasn't a question. As the doctor began setting Marcus's nose, explaining that the break was clean but would require a splint for several weeks, Reynolds stepped outside to issue orders. Her voice carried through the partially open door. "Officer Brennan is suspended immediately pending investigation. Secure his credentials and escort him from the building." More commotion followed, Brennan's protests growing louder, then gradually fading as he was presumably led away. The doctor finished applying the splint, handed Marcus some pain medication, and advised him to rest. "Not likely," Marcus said carefully, dabbing at the remaining blood on his shirt with a wet cloth. Reynolds returned, accompanied by James Willis, who looked pale and shaken. "The press is already gathering outside," Willis reported. "Someone tipped them off." Reynolds sighed heavily. "We can issue a statement, try to control the narrative." She was interrupted by Marcus's phone ringing. He glanced at the screen. Tanya. Someone had informed his wife. "I need to take this," he said, stepping into a corner of the room. Tanya's voice was tight with worry. "Marcus, what happened?" "I got a call saying you were assaulted at the courthouse." Marcus gave her a brief account, downplaying the severity of his injury, but not the seriousness of the incident. "I'll be home soon," he promised. "It looks worse than it is." By the time he ended the call, 2 more people had entered the room. Lawrence Mitchell, a longtime friend and fellow attorney, and Judge Eliza Washington, the only other black judge currently sitting on the district court. Lawrence looked ready for battle. "This is battery on a federal official," he said without preamble, "plus civil rights violations, abuse of power under color of law. We're talking serious federal charges, Marcus." Eliza said nothing at first, simply studying Marcus's injured face with an expression that spoke volumes. Finally, she said quietly, "Welcome to the bench, Judge Wilson. I wish I could say I'm surprised." Reynolds cleared her throat. "We need to discuss next steps. The integrity of the court is at stake." Marcus nodded carefully, mindful of his injured nose. "I need some time to think. This isn't just about me." Desiree, who had remained quietly in the background, spoke up again. "Judge Wilson, despite what happened, I want you to know many of us on staff have been looking forward to your appointment. This incident, it's terrible, but maybe it's also an opportunity." Marcus considered her words as the doctor handed him aftercare instructions. His phone buzzed continuously with notifications. News alerts, messages from colleagues, calls from civil rights leaders who had somehow already learned of the incident. As a lawyer, Marcus had always advised clients to press charges immediately in cases of clear assault, especially those with racial motivations. As a judge, however, he now faced a more complex calculation. Any action he took would set the tone for his entire tenure on the bench. If he appeared too aggressive in seeking justice for himself, he might be perceived as using his position for personal vendetta. If he was too lenient, he might signal that such behavior could be tolerated. The dilemma reminded him painfully of similar situations throughout his career. The time a partner at his first law firm had loudly questioned whether he was an attorney or the cleaning staff. The security guard who had followed him through an upscale store while ignoring white shoppers. The police officer who had drawn a gun during a routine traffic stop. Each time Marcus had calculated the cost of confrontation versus the price of silence. Each time the equation had been complicated by considerations of career safety and the broader impact on his community. Now the stakes were even higher. By the time Tanya arrived at the courthouse, her face tight with worry, Marcus had made a decision. "I'm not going to rush this," he told her as she gently examined his injured face. "What that man did was inexcusable, but how I respond will affect every person who walks into this courthouse looking for justice." Reynolds approached, having just returned from issuing a brief statement to the press. "The news is already trending on social media," she reported grimly. "Someone leaked partial video footage from the security area." Marcus wasn't surprised. In an age of smartphones, and instant communication containment was rarely possible. "Good," he said, surprising everyone in the room. "Let people see what happened. I have nothing to hide." Lawrence looked skeptical. "Marcus, you know how these things get spun. They'll dig into your background, try to paint you as the aggressor somehow." Marcus stood carefully steadying himself against a momentary wave of dizziness. "Let them try. I've spent my career fighting for justice in courtrooms across this state. Now I'm in a position to ensure justice from the bench itself." He turned to Tanya, whose eyes shone with a mixture of pride and concern. "This isn't just about me anymore," he told her, unconsciously echoing Desiree's earlier sentiment. "It's about every black person who walks into that courthouse expecting justice. What happened today happens every day to people without badges or titles to protect them." 3 days after the assault, Marcus sat on his back porch, the morning sun warming his face despite the autumn chill in the air. The swelling around his nose had subsided somewhat, but the bruising had deepened to a dramatic purple-black that spread beneath both eyes, giving him what his son Jamal had unhelpfully described as serious raccoon vibes. His phone, which lay on the table beside him, had barely stopped buzzing since the incident. Civil rights organizations, media outlets, political figures, and concerned citizens had all reached out, offering support, seeking statements, or demanding action. On his tablet, Marcus scrolled through news coverage that ranged from straightforward reporting to thinly veiled attempts to question his account. One particularly reprehensible blog had already begun circulating the narrative that Marcus had deliberately provoked Brennan as part of a social justice setup. The doorbell rang, and moments later, Tanya led retired Judge Howard Thompson onto the porch. At 75, Thompson still carried himself with the dignified bearing that had made him a formidable presence on the bench for 3 decades. His face darkened at the sight of Marcus's injuries. 40 years, he said without preamble, lowering himself carefully into a chair. 40 years, and some things haven't changed nearly enough. Tanya brought out coffee before excusing herself, understanding that the 2 men needed to speak privately. Thompson took a sip, then fixed Marcus with a penetrating gaze. "You're not the first black judge to be assaulted in that courthouse," he said quietly. "Back in '91, a bailiff accidentally knocked Judge William Hastings down a flight of stairs after Hastings ruled against a white police officer in a misconduct case. Hastings broke 3 ribs. Marcus frowned. I never heard about that. Thompson's smile was bitter. That was the point. It was handled internally. Hastings was convinced to accept an apology and a transfer for the bailiff. No charges, no public statement, no record. He leaned forward. They're already trying the same playbook with you. I got a call from Gerald Fisher last night. Marcus recognized the name, a senior judge known for his behind-the-scenes influence. Let me guess he suggested I allow the court to handle this matter discreetly for the good of the institution. Thompson nodded. He emphasized your promising career and how unfortunate it would be if your judgeship began with unnecessary controversy. Marcus felt a familiar anger rising. Unnecessary controversy, as if a racist officer breaking a judge's nose is a minor administrative hiccup. Thompson's eyes held decades of similar frustrations. They're afraid, Marcus, not just of the publicity, but of what you might do with your authority now. You have options they can't control. Throughout the afternoon, Marcus developed a multi-pronged strategy. First, he would refuse to recuse himself from any involvement in the investigation of courthouse security practices, arguing correctly that while he should not oversee Brennan's specific case, the broader systemic issues were precisely his concern as a new judge. Second, he would systematically document all instances of discriminatory practices within the courthouse, creating an irrefutable record. Finally, he would use his judicial authority to implement new training requirements and accountability measures. With Thompson's guidance, Marcus began making calls. By evening, he had assembled a small but committed group of courthouse employees, willing to share their experiences, including Desiree Jackson, who had been documenting security disparities for months as part of her law school thesis. "There's something else you should know," Desiree told Marcus during a confidential meeting at his home. "Brennan has a history of complaints that were buried. At least 3 formal grievances from black attorneys who experienced similar treatment, though none were assaulted." She hesitated. "I shouldn't have access to this information, but I work in records and I've seen the files marked resolved without any actual resolution documented." The next morning, Marcus received an unexpected call from the governor, a man he had met only twice at legal functions. "Judge Wilson," the governor began with practiced concern, "this unfortunate incident has the potential to undermine public confidence in our judicial system. Perhaps a period of paid leave while things settle down might be beneficial for all concerned." The suggestion was delivered smoothly, but the implication was clear: disappear until this blows over. "Thank you for your concern, Governor," Marcus replied evenly, "but I'll be assuming my duties as scheduled next week." After ending the call, Marcus shared the conversation with Lawrence, who had been helping him map connections between key figures in the courthouse hierarchy. "That confirms our suspicion," Lawrence said, adding the governor's name to their whiteboard diagram. "Brennan has protection from somewhere high up." The diagram was revealing a disturbing pattern. Brennan had connections to several powerful judges in the district through various social and professional relationships. Most concerning was his apparent friendship with Judge Raymond Sullivan, who oversaw judicial assignments and administrative matters. "This explains why complaints against Brennan never went anywhere," Marcus observed. "The system is designed to protect him." As they continued their investigation, more patterns emerged. Black attorneys were consistently subjected to more rigorous security screening than their white counterparts. Black defendants and their families faced longer wait times and more frequent secondary screenings. Even black judges from other districts reported unusual scrutiny when visiting the courthouse. The evidence was becoming undeniable. What Marcus had experienced wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systemic problem. That evening, as Marcus reviewed their findings, Tanya entered his home office with a troubled expression. "I just got another call," she said quietly. "Someone saying you should let it go if you know what's good for your family." Marcus set down his papers, alarmed. "Did you recognize the voice?" Tanya shook her head. It was distorted, like they were using something to change it. Marcus immediately called Lawrence, who arrived within the hour, to help them file a police report and set up additional security measures for their home. The threats extended beyond phone calls. The next day, Jamal came home from school visibly upset. Several classmates, children of local officials and judges, had made comments suggesting his father was playing the race card and trying to bring down a good officer. Aisha reported similar experiences, with one teacher even making a pointed comment about people who make everything about race. Despite the mounting pressure, Marcus continued his preparations to officially take the bench. The night before his first day, he laid out his judicial robes, the dark fabric a stark contrast to the still visible bruising on his face. Tanya watched from the doorway as he tried on the robes, testing how they felt, how they moved with him. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "No one would blame you for taking time to heal first." Marcus turned to face her, the black robes lending him an added gravity, despite his injured appearance. "That's exactly why I have to do it," he replied. "Because taking time to heal first has never been an option for people who look like us. We've always had to show up, do the job, and fight for justice while still bleeding from the last battle." He straightened the robes with a deliberate gesture. "Tomorrow, every person in that courtroom will see exactly what happened to me, and they'll see that it didn't stop me from doing what I was appointed to do." Tanya crossed the room and carefully adjusted his collar. "Then they'll also see that you didn't do it alone," she said, her voice fierce with pride and determination. "We face this together, like always." Marcus nodded, thinking of the allies who had emerged in recent days. Courthouse staff tired of witnessing discrimination, fellow judges disgusted by the assault community members rallying to demand accountability. What had begun as a personal injury was transforming into something much larger, a catalyst for change that was long overdue. "Today we start changing the system from within," Marcus said, feeling the weight of the robes on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as armor for the battles ahead. The morning of Marcus's official first day dawned clear and cool, the October sun casting long shadows across the courthouse plaza, where a crowd had already gathered. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes extending skyward like metal flowers seeking light. Protesters stood on both sides of the courthouse steps, one group holding signs demanding justice and accountability, the other smaller contingent supporting Brennan with messages about rushing to judgment and supporting our officers. Marcus had insisted on driving himself despite Tanya's concerns. "I won't arrive looking like I'm afraid," he'd told her over breakfast. As his car approached the judicial parking area, photographers rushed forward, cameras flashing through the windows. Court security officers, conspicuously not including any of Brennan's close associates, formed a corridor to escort Marcus inside. He walked slowly but purposefully, his face still bearing the unmistakable evidence of the assault, the splinted nose, the dark bruising around his eyes. He had deliberately chosen not to wear makeup that might have concealed the injuries. "Let them see," he had told Tanya. "Let everyone see." Entering through the same security checkpoint where the incident had occurred felt like crossing an invisible threshold. The officers staffed there today were excessively polite, almost apologetic in their efficiency. "Good morning, Judge Wilson," they murmured, their eyes sliding away from his injured face. The courthouse lobby had a strange, hushed quality conversations, pausing as Marcus passed, then resuming in urgent whispers behind him. Staff members nodded respectfully, some offering quiet words of welcome or support, others maintaining a careful neutrality that spoke volumes about the divided atmosphere. Desiree Jackson waited near the elevators with a stack of files and a determined expression. "These are the cases on your docket today, Judge Wilson," she said professionally, though her eyes conveyed much more. "The briefs are tabbed and annotated as requested." As they rode up to the judicial chamber's floor, Desiree spoke quietly. "The other judges are waiting to greet you in the conference room. Judge Sullivan suggested a private welcome before court begins." Marcus nodded, understanding the subtext. Sullivan, with his connections to Brennan, would be taking the temperature of the situation, gauging Marcus's intentions. The judge's conference room presented a tableau of carefully calibrated reactions. Some colleagues approached immediately with handshakes and expressions of outrage over what had happened. Others maintained a cordial but reserved distance. Judge Sullivan, a tall man with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority, offered a handshake that was professionally firm but emotionally noncommittal. A most unfortunate introduction to our court family. Judge Wilson, he said, his voice pitched to carry to the others in the room. I trust you're healing well. The question felt perfunctory, especially given that the evidence of Marcus's injuries was plainly visible. Well enough to fulfill my duties, Marcus replied simply. Judge Eliza Washington approached her presence a welcome counterpoint to Sullivan's calculated cordiality. Your courtroom is prepared, she said. I took the liberty of checking it myself this morning. The subtle emphasis on myself communicated her distrust of leaving such details to potentially hostile staff members. Court began at 9:30 sharp. Marcus entered the courtroom to the traditional "all rise," feeling the weight of dozens of curious gazes as attorneys, defendants, court reporters, and spectators took in his injured appearance. He moved with deliberate dignity to the bench, the black judicial robes flowing around him as he took his seat. Be seated, he said, his voice clear and authoritative, despite the nasal quality imposed by his injury. The first case was a relatively straightforward motion hearing in a civil matter. Marcus had studied the briefs, thoroughly determined that his first official proceeding would demonstrate his preparedness and judicial temperament, regardless of personal circumstances. As the attorneys presented their arguments, Marcus noticed the sideways glances, the whispered comments behind hands, the shocked expressions of those who hadn't expected the new judge to appear with such visible injuries. He maintained his focus on the legal issues at hand, asking pointed questions that quickly established his command of the case details. When court recessed for lunch, Marcus declined invitations to join other judges in their private dining area, choosing instead to return to his chambers to review afternoon cases. Upon entering his office, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The space had been prepared for him days earlier, with his personal items arranged according to his preferences, but now things were subtly out of place. Opening his desk drawer, he discovered the source of his unease. Scrawled in thick black marker across his legal pad were several racial slurs and a crude drawing of a noose. Marcus stared at the violation of his space, feeling a cold anger settle in his chest. He was photographing the vandalism with his phone when James Willis, the court administrator, knocked and entered without waiting for a response. "Judge Wilson, I wanted to check if everything is—" Willis stopped abruptly, seeing the defaced legal pad in Marcus's hands. "My God," he said, his face paling. "I'll call security immediately." Marcus regarded him steadily. "Do you really think that's the best course of action, given that security staff are the most likely culprits?" Willis shifted uncomfortably. "Surely this is just some misguided prank. Perhaps cleaning staff, or—" "This is not a prank, Mr. Willis." Marcus interrupted, his voice level but intense. "This is intimidation and harassment based on race occurring in a federal courthouse. It requires a proper investigation, not excuses or minimization." Willis seemed to deflate slightly. "Of course, Judge. I'll contact the U.S. Marshals Service instead of our internal security." After Willis left, Marcus placed the legal pad in an evidence bag from his prosecutor days, which he still carried in his briefcase out of habit. He was securing it in his safe when Desiree arrived with his afternoon calendar. "Your 1 o'clock is ready, Judge, but there's something else you should know," she said, closing the door behind her. "Judge Sullivan has called a closed-door meeting of all judges for 4:30. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. Topic: Officially, security protocols review, Desiree replied. Unofficially, I've heard it's about whether you should recuse yourself from any involvement in the Brennan investigation. The afternoon session proceeded without incident, though Marcus noticed several attorneys watching him with newfound respect as he navigated complex legal arguments despite his obvious discomfort. By 4:15 he had completed his docket and prepared for the judge's meeting, reviewing judicial ethics rules regarding recusal. The judge's conference room was tense when Marcus arrived, conversation stopping abruptly as he entered. Chief Judge Reynolds called the meeting to order promptly at 4:30. "We're here to discuss security protocols in light of recent events," she began diplomatically, "and to address any concerns about potential conflicts of interest in ongoing investigations." Judge Sullivan cleared his throat. "I'll speak plainly. Judge Wilson was involved in a regrettable incident with Officer Brennan. While we all sympathize with his experience, judicial ethics require that he recuse himself from any matters involving the officer or security protocols generally." Several judges nodded in agreement while others looked uncertain. Marcus waited for Sullivan to finish before responding. "With respect, Judge Sullivan, the judicial ethics rules don't support your position. A judge who is the victim of a crime is not automatically recused from similar cases unless there's evidence of bias that would prevent fair judgment." He opened a reference book he had brought, turning to a marked page. "Furthermore, while I would certainly recuse myself from any criminal or civil case specifically involving Officer Brennan, the broader issue of security protocols falls squarely within my administrative duties as a judge in this district." Judge Washington spoke up in support. "Judge Wilson is correct. There's no ethical basis for excluding him from administrative oversight of courthouse security, generally." The debate continued for nearly an hour, with Marcus calmly refuting each argument for his broad recusal with precise legal reasoning. Eventually, even Sullivan had to concede that the ethics rules didn't support his position, though his expressions suggested the matter was far from settled. As the meeting concluded, Marcus returned to his chambers to gather his things. Finding yet another anonymous note slipped under his door, "Know your place or regret it." He added it to the evidence bag with the defaced legal pad. When he requested security footage of the hallway outside his chambers, he was told by a nervous IT technician that the relevant footage had been accidentally overwritten during routine system maintenance. The pattern was becoming clear, a systematic attempt to intimidate him while eliminating evidence of the perpetrators. Walking toward the parking garage that evening, Marcus encountered Judge Eliza Washington waiting beside her car. "Not a coincidence, I take it?" he asked, appreciating her discretion in arranging this seemingly casual meeting. "Wanted to make sure you got to your car safely," she replied, her voice low, "and to tell you what I couldn't say in there. This has happened before. Black judges facing accidents, threats, vandalism. Most either transfer to different districts or learn to keep their heads down." Marcus studied her face, seeing the toll such calculations had taken over the years. "But not you," he observed. She smiled thinly. "Not me. And from what I saw today, not you either." Before they parted, she shared one final piece of information. "The district attorney is dragging his feet on Brennan's case. Word is he's claiming insufficient evidence, despite the recording and multiple witnesses." Marcus nodded, adding this to his mental map of the opposition forming against him. "Thank you, Judge Washington." "Eliza," she corrected him. "We're in this together now. Do you believe the courthouse staff are actively conspiring against Judge Wilson, or are these isolated incidents from a few bad actors?" Comment number 1, if you think there's a widespread cover-up happening, or, number 2, if you think Marcus is facing resistance from just a small group. Like and subscribe to see how deep this corruption goes. Is Judge Wilson fighting a losing battle against an entrenched system, or does he have more allies than he realizes? Stay tuned to see how he navigates these dangerous waters while maintaining his judicial integrity. The rally in support of Officer Brennan occupied the public park across from the courthouse, drawing a crowd that Marcus estimated at about 200 people. From his chamber's window, he could see the signs, "Support our officers," "Due process for Brennan," and more disturbingly, "No social justice judges." What troubled Marcus most was the presence of at least 24 police officers in uniform among the protesters, a clear violation of department policy regarding political activities while in uniform. He took photos with his phone documenting the scene for his growing file of evidence. It had been 2 weeks since the assault, and the organized resistance to his presence on the bench had crystallized into something more formidable than he had initially anticipated. That morning's local news broadcast had featured an interview with Brennan, now clean-shaven and dressed in a suit rather than his uniform, speaking solemnly about his 20 years of unblemished service and how one misunderstanding was being used to destroy his career. The interviewer had asked no challenging questions, allowing Brennan to present himself as the victim of circumstances and political correctness. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Lawrence. "Seen the news they're running with the dedicated officer one mistake angle. No mention of the racial slurs or your credentials." Marcus wasn't surprised. The narrative was being carefully shaped by interests that extended far beyond Brennan himself. His own experience with the media had been mixed at best. While national outlets had generally reported the facts accurately, local coverage had increasingly adopted frames that cast doubt on his account or emphasized the complexity of courthouse security. One particularly egregious editorial had suggested that both sides needed to de-escalate the situation for the good of the community, as if being assaulted and fighting for accountability were somehow equivalent to committing assault and evading responsibility. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. His clerk, a young white man named Kevin Phillips, who had been assigned to him by Judge Sullivan's office, entered with a stack of files. "The Jenkins case has been reassigned to Judge Harrington," he announced without preamble. "And the Thompson civil rights matter to Judge Coleman." Marcus frowned. This was the third case that had been mysteriously reassigned away from him in the past week. "On whose authority?" Kevin shrugged, not meeting Marcus's eyes. "The order came from the Assignments Committee. Judge Sullivan signed off on it." The pattern was becoming clear. Cases involving civil rights issues or police misconduct were being systematically redirected away from his docket. Meanwhile, he was receiving an unusually high number of routine contract disputes and minor federal regulatory matters. "I've also been told that the research assistants are all tied up with other projects, so they won't be available to help with your backlog until next month, at the earliest." Kevin added his tone, suggesting this was simply an administrative inconvenience rather than another example of the coordinated effort to undermine Marcus's effectiveness. "Is there anything else?" Marcus asked, watching Kevin's body language carefully. The young clerk hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Chief Judge Reynolds asked to reschedule your meeting this afternoon. She's been called to an emergency budget session." This was the third time Reynolds had postponed their planned discussion about security reforms. Her initial outrage over the assault seemed to be giving way to institutional caution, perhaps in response to pressure from other quarters. After Kevin left, Marcus pulled up the local news website on his computer, scanning the coverage of Brennan's rally. A quote from a county commissioner caught his eye. "We need to let the process work, without outside agendas influencing what should be a fair investigation." The commissioner, Marcus noted, was the brother-in-law of Judge Sullivan. The connections were becoming clearer each day. His research had revealed that Brennan's father-in-law, Walter Simmons, was not only a major donor to the governor's campaign, but also sat on the board of the private security company that had received the courthouse security training contract for the past decade. The web of relationships explained much about why Brennan had remained untouchable for so long. Marcus's desk phone rang, an internal call from Desiree Jackson. "Judge Wilson, I've been placed on administrative leave," she said without preamble, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Apparently there are concerns about my recent performance that require review." Marcus felt a surge of protective anger. "This is retaliation for your testimony." "Officially, it's about documentation errors in the filing system," Desiree replied. "But yes, the timing makes the real reason obvious." My supervisor mentioned that perhaps I've been distracted by outside matters, after assuring Desiree that he would address the situation. Marcus ended the call and sat back in his chair, considering his next move. The resistance he faced was no longer subtle. It was a coordinated campaign to isolate him, undermine his authority, and pressure him to back down. The stakes extended beyond his own situation to affect those who had supported him. That evening, as Marcus drove home, he noticed a police cruiser following him, maintaining a consistent distance that was too precise to be coincidental. When he turned into his neighborhood, the cruiser continued straight, but the message had been delivered: "We're watching you." At home, Tanya met him at the door with news that compounded his concerns. "I was passed over for the department head position." She said, her expression a mixture of anger and resignation. "They gave it to David Chen, who has 5 years less experience and no administrative background." Marcus embraced her, feeling the tension in her shoulders. "Because of me," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Tanya pulled back to look at him. "Because of people who think intimidation still works. Because of a system that punishes those who challenge it." Later that night, their son Jamal returned home visibly upset. He had been pulled over while driving home from basketball practice, the third such incident in the past 2 weeks. "They said my taillight was out," he reported, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "It wasn't. I checked immediately after they let me go." Marcus felt the familiar cold weight of parental fear mixed with outrage. The targeting of his family was crossing a dangerous line. Throughout the next day at the courthouse, Marcus methodically documented every irregularity, every instance of obstructed work, every reassigned case. He was building a comprehensive file that would eventually become impossible to ignore. During a rare lunch with Judge Washington, he learned that witnesses to Brennan's previous misconduct were suddenly changing their stories. 3 courthouse employees who initially gave statements about Brennan's history of discriminatory behavior have recanted, she informed him quietly. "They're all saying they misremembered or misinterpreted the incidents." Marcus wasn't surprised. Pressure from above. Eliza nodded. One was told his position might be eliminated in budget cuts. Another has a pending application for her daughter to attend the governor's special science program. The systematic nature of the resistance confirmed Marcus's decision to elevate the matter beyond local authorities. That afternoon, he placed a call to an old law school classmate who now worked in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. "This isn't just about my assault anymore," he explained. "It's about a pattern of discrimination and obstruction that appears to reach into multiple levels of the courthouse administration." His friend agreed to open a preliminary inquiry, warning that the process would be necessarily methodical and discreet in its early stages. Back in his chambers, Marcus drafted an official judicial order requiring the preservation of all security footage, personnel records, and communications related to courthouse security protocols for the past 5 years. As a sitting federal judge, he had the authority to issue such an order, though he anticipated resistance. He was careful to frame the order in terms of general administrative oversight rather than focusing specifically on Brennan's case, making it harder to challenge on grounds of personal interest. Just as he was finalizing the document, his clerk Kevin entered with an unusual request. "Judge Sullivan would like to meet with you privately in his chambers." The invitation, coming after weeks of obvious obstruction, raised Marcus's suspicions. "Did he mention the purpose of the meeting?" Kevin shook his head. "Just that it was a confidential matter requiring immediate attention." Marcus considered declining, but recognized the potential strategic value in hearing whatever Sullivan had to say. "Tell Judge Sullivan I'll be there in 15 minutes. Before heading to the meeting, Marcus made 2 precautionary moves. He emailed a copy of his draft preservation order to his personal account and to Judge Washington, and he activated the voice recording app on his phone. Sullivan's chambers were an exercise in carefully curated gravitas. leather-bound law books, historical documents in gilded frames, and photographs of Sullivan with various political figures. The judge himself sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, rising only slightly in acknowledgment of Marcus's entrance. "Judge Wilson, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Marcus remained standing. "I prefer to stand, thank you. My doctor recommends it for circulation after sitting in court all day." It was a minor assertion of independence, but Sullivan's momentary frown suggested it had registered as such. "As you wish." Sullivan settled back into his chair. "I'll come straight to the point. This situation with Officer Brennan has created unnecessary tension in our courthouse community. The continued focus on this unfortunate incident is distracting from our judicial mission." Marcus waited, sensing there was more to come. "I've spoken with several key stakeholders, including the governor and Chief Judge Reynolds," Sullivan continued. "We believe the most constructive path forward would be for you to accept Officer Brennan's formal apology, allow him to take early retirement with his pension intact, and issue a joint statement about moving forward in a spirit of reconciliation." The offer was so inadequate, so dismissive of the seriousness of what had occurred, that Marcus almost laughed. Instead, he maintained his composure, studying Sullivan's expression. "And if I find those terms unacceptable?" Sullivan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Judge Wilson, you have a promising career ahead of you. 40, perhaps 50 years on the bench. That's a long time to work in an environment where, let's say, collaborative goodwill is essential to effectiveness." The threat was thinly veiled, but unmistakable. Marcus nodded slowly, as if considering the proposition. "I appreciate your concern for my career, Judge Sullivan. I'll give your suggestion the consideration it deserves." As he turned to leave, Sullivan added, "Oh, and that preservation order you're drafting, I wouldn't recommend it." Such a broad directive might be seen as overreaching by a new judge, possibly even as abuse of judicial authority for personal purposes. Marcus paused at the door. "Interesting that you know about an order that exists only in draft form in my private chambers, Judge Sullivan. That will be an interesting detail to include in my communication with the Department of Justice." He left Sullivan's chambers feeling a grim satisfaction at the older judge's momentarily shocked expression. As he walked back to his office, his phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "Midnight, East Courthouse parking lot. Information you need. Come alone." Marcus stared at the message, weighing the obvious risk against the potential value of whatever information was being offered. After everything he had uncovered about the systemic nature of the corruption he faced, he knew that conventional approaches might not be sufficient. Sometimes fighting for justice required stepping into uncertain territory. He deleted the message and continued to his chambers, already planning how he would safely make the midnight meeting while ensuring he wasn't walking into a trap. The morning of Brennan's disciplinary hearing dawned gray and drizzling, the weather matching the somber mood that had settled over Marcus in the preceding days. The midnight meeting in the parking lot had provided him with crucial evidence: internal emails and security reports documenting Brennan's history of discriminatory behavior, along with evidence of the systematic covering up of complaints. His mysterious informant had turned out to be a long-time courthouse security officer named James Turner, who had witnessed years of misconduct but had been afraid to come forward until now. "I'm retiring next month anyway," Turner had explained, handing over a flash drive in the rain-slicked parking lot. "They can't hurt me much at this point, and I can't keep silent anymore after what happened to you." The information had confirmed Marcus's suspicions about the depth and breadth of the problem. Brennan wasn't simply one bad officer. He was the visible symptom of a system that had been protecting and enabling discrimination for years. As Marcus prepared to leave for the courthouse, he discovered another message had been delivered overnight. His car's windshield had been spray-painted with a racial slur, the black letters stark against the gray morning light. Tanya came outside as he was photographing the damage, her sharp intake of breath, the only sound in the quiet suburban street. "I'll call Lawrence," she said, her voice tight with anger. "This is escalating beyond threats now." Marcus nodded, feeling a strange calm despite the ugliness of the vandalism. "They're getting desperate. That's actually a good sign." The Judicial Conduct Committee had convened in the largest conference room, a space typically reserved for full bench meetings. 5 judges would hear the evidence, 2 appointed by Chief Judge Reynolds, 2 by the Judicial Council, and 1 selected by random draw. Marcus had been concerned about the composition until the random selection had yielded Judge Washington providing at least one voice he knew would be fair. The room was already crowded when Marcus arrived. Brennan sat at one table with his attorney, a well-known lawyer who specialized in defending police officers accused of misconduct. Brennan had transformed his appearance since the assault. Gone was the aggressive security officer with the military-style haircut, replaced by a subdued figure in a conservative suit, his hair neatly trimmed, and his expression appropriately serious. The makeover was so obvious it bordered on theatrical, but Marcus knew it would be effective with certain audiences. At the other table sat the court's appointed prosecutor, a former U.S. attorney named Catherine Zhao, who had a reputation for thoroughness. Marcus had met with her twice to provide his testimony and evidence, finding her professional but non-committal in her assessment of the case. Behind the tables, the gallery was filled with courthouse staff, other judges, and a few selected members of the press who had been granted access to what was technically a closed proceeding. Marcus noted the presence of several officers in plain clothes, presumably colleagues of Brennan's, their expressions ranging from hostile to smugly confident. As Marcus made his way to his seat, he felt their eyes following him, the collective weight of their judgment and resentment. The committee chair, Judge Leonard Hoffman, called the hearing to order precisely at 9 o'clock. This proceeding will determine whether Officer Richard Brennan violated courthouse policies and ethical standards in his interaction with Judge Marcus Wilson on October 4th. This is not a criminal proceeding, but an administrative review to determine appropriate employment action. All Hoffman's tone suggested he viewed the matter as an unfortunate but routine personnel issue rather than the serious breach of trust and law that it was. Brennan's attorney, Michael Daniels, presented his opening statement, first immediately setting a tone that made Marcus's jaw tighten. Officer Richard Brennan has served this courthouse with distinction for 20 years. Daniels began, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. In that time, he has processed hundreds of thousands of visitors without incident, maintaining the security and dignity of this institution under often challenging circumstances. Daniels paced slightly, making eye contact with committee members. What happened on October 4th was regrettable, a misunderstanding between 2 men, each believing they were doing their job correctly. Officer Brennan, faced with an individual he didn't recognize who was behaving in what he perceived as an agitated manner, made a split-second decision that he now acknowledges was incorrect. The characterization was so at odds with reality that Marcus had to force himself to maintain a neutral expression. Daniels continued, "We will show that Officer Brennan had no knowledge of Judge Wilson's identity, that he believed he was responding to a potential security threat, and that while his response was perhaps excessive, it was not motivated by racial animus, but by a genuine concern for courthouse safety." When Catherine Zhao rose for her opening statement, her approach was methodical and fact-based. The evidence will show that Officer Brennan not only used excessive force against Judge Wilson, but that he did so after making multiple racially charged comments. Furthermore, we will demonstrate that this incident was not isolated, but part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior that has been documented but never properly addressed. The hearing proceeded with testimony from witnesses to the incident. Court staff described what they had observed, though Marcus noted that several seemed to have developed convenient memory gaps about specific details, particularly regarding Brennan's language and aggressive behavior prior to the assault. When Desiree Jackson took the stand, the atmosphere in the room perceptibly shifted. Despite being on administrative leave and facing obvious professional risk, she spoke clearly and confidently, describing both what she had witnessed and the pattern of behavior she had documented over months. I observed Officer Brennan consistently subjecting black visitors to more intensive screening than white visitors, she testified. This included longer wait times, more frequent secondary screenings, and a noticeably different tone and manner of address. When she played the audio recording she had captured outside the security room, Brennan's voice was clearly audible, using racial slurs and threatening language. His attorney objected immediately, claiming the recording violated privacy expectations and courthouse policy prohibiting unauthorized recordings. Judge Hoffman seemed inclined to sustain the objection until Judge Washington intervened. This recording documents potential criminal behavior and civil rights violations, she pointed out. Federal whistleblower protections would apply to Ms. Jackson in this circumstance, overriding any courthouse policy regarding recordings. After a brief conference, the committee allowed the recording to remain in evidence, though Hoffman's expression suggested he was displeased with the ruling. Throughout the morning, Marcus observed Brennan carefully. The officer maintained a composed expression for the most part, though Marcus noted flashes of the real Brennan emerging when particularly damaging testimony was presented. A tightening around the eyes, a momentary clench of the jaw, a quick glance toward his supporters in the gallery seeking reassurance. When it was finally Marcus's turn to testify, he felt a strange sense of calm. The weeks of resistance and intimidation had only strengthened his resolve to speak the truth clearly and completely. He took the oath and settled into the witness chair, meeting each committee member's gaze directly before beginning his testimony. I chose to visit the courthouse incognito before my official start date because I wanted to observe normal operations without the filter that comes with title and position, he explained. What I witnessed was a security system that functioned very differently depending on the race of the person passing through it. Marcus described the events leading up to the assault in precise detail, neither embellishing nor minimizing what had occurred. When he reached the moment of the assault itself, he paused briefly, noting how Brennan seemed to sink slightly in his chair. After Officer Brennan struck me breaking my nose, he immediately began claiming that I had attacked him first. He appeared not frightened, as one might expect if he truly believed I posed a threat, but angry. Angry that I had challenged his authority. Marcus then moved beyond his personal experience to present the evidence he had gathered about the broader pattern of discrimination, including the documents provided by Officer Turner and testimonials from other black attorneys and courthouse visitors who had experienced similar treatment. This wasn't about one officer having a bad day, Marcus concluded. This was about a system that permitted and protected discriminatory practices until they eventually escalated to violence. During cross-examination, Brennan's attorney attempted to portray Marcus as having deliberately provoked the incident by concealing his identity and questioning security procedures. Isn't it true, Judge Wilson, that you could have simply identified yourself as the newly appointed judge at any point during this interaction? Daniels asked his tone, suggesting Marcus had been playing some kind of game. I could have, Marcus acknowledged, but that would have defeated the purpose of observing regular courthouse operations. And more importantly, no citizen should face racial slurs or physical assault regardless of their title or position. The answer seemed to resonate with at least some committee members who nodded slightly. The final witness was Brennan himself. His attorney had clearly coached him extensively as he presented a carefully crafted image of a dedicated officer who had made one regrettable mistake in the heat of a confusing moment. I deeply regret what happened. Brennan stated, his voice appropriately subdued. Had I known Judge Wilson's identity, of course, I would have treated him with the respect his position deserves. The phrasing was revealing, suggesting that respect was contingent on title rather than inherent human dignity. During Zhao's cross-examination, she methodically dismantled Brennan's claimed ignorance of racial bias. Officer Brennan, how do you explain the recorded statements where you used racial slurs to refer to Judge Wilson? Brennan shifted uncomfortably. "I was under extreme stress in that moment. Those words don't reflect my true beliefs or normal conduct." Zhao pressed further. "Yet we have testimony from multiple witnesses describing similar language used on other occasions. Are they all mistaken?" As the questioning continued, Brennan's carefully constructed facade began to crack. When Zhao presented him with the documentation of previous complaints, he became visibly agitated. "Those complaints were investigated and dismissed," he insisted, his voice rising. "This is a witch hunt because the system needs a scapegoat." The outburst hung in the air, Brennan's face flushing as he realized his mistake. His attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm, but the damage was done. The committee had glimpsed the real Brennan beneath the contrite exterior. After both sides presented closing arguments, Judge Hoffman announced that the committee would deliberate and issue their decision within 72 hours. "This matter requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances." He stated his tone, suggesting he viewed the entire proceeding as an unfortunate necessity rather than a crucial moment of accountability. As the hearing adjourned, Marcus found himself surrounded by a mix of supporters and hostile observers in the crowded hallway. Brennan's colleagues formed a protective circle around him as he exited, some casting challenging glances in Marcus's direction. One officer brushed deliberately against Marcus's shoulder as he passed, murmuring something under his breath that Marcus couldn't quite catch, but recognized as threatening in tone. The atmosphere was tense, the courthouse divided into visible factions. Marcus was discussing next steps with Catherine Zhao when he was approached by James Willis, the court administrator, who had been notably absent from the hearing. "Judge Wilson, a word." Willis guided Marcus to a quiet corner, his expression troubled. "I've learned that 2 members of the committee have personal connections to Brennan that weren't disclosed. Judge Peterson's brother-in-law works with Brennan's father-in-law at the security company that trains our officers, and Judge Miller's son recently received assistance from Brennan in having a DUI charge reduced." The information wasn't entirely surprising given what Marcus had already uncovered about the web of relationships protecting Brennan, but it presented a difficult choice. Challenging the committee's impartiality now would create additional delays and potentially further divide the courthouse. Not challenging, it might allow a biased decision to stand unchallenged. As Marcus weighed his options, his phone rang, an unknown number with the state capital area code. "Judge Wilson, this is Attorney General Sofia Rodriguez. I've been following your situation with great interest and concern. My office is prepared to take over the investigation into not just Officer Brennan's actions, but the broader pattern of civil rights violations you've documented. Would you be available to meet tomorrow morning?" The call represented an unexpected shift in the landscape, support from a level of authority that might actually have the power to create meaningful change rather than merely symbolic consequences. As Marcus ended the call, he felt the first genuine sense of hope since the assault. The system was resistant, the opposition was entrenched and powerful, but perhaps justice was still possible if pursued through the right channels with sufficient evidence and determination. 3 weeks after the hearing, Marcus sat in his chambers reviewing the committee's decision document for perhaps the 10th time. The outcome had been predictably underwhelming. Brennan had been terminated from his position, but would face no criminal charges. The committee had acknowledged the assault, but framed it as an isolated lapse in judgment by an otherwise exemplary officer, language that deliberately ignored the substantial evidence of Brennan's history of discriminatory behavior. The document made no mention of the systemic issues Marcus had presented, effectively treating the incident as a regrettable but singular event rather than a symptom of deeper problems. On his desk sat another document that gave him more hope. A letter from Attorney General Rodriguez confirming that her office was launching a comprehensive investigation into the courthouse's security practices with a specific focus on potential civil rights violations. The investigation would have the authority to examine records, interview personnel, and issue binding recommendations for reform. It wasn't the swift justice Marcus had initially hoped for, but it was potentially more significant in the long term. Outside his window, the November sun cast long shadows across the courthouse plaza. 3 months into his judgeship, Marcus had already faced more opposition and learned more about the institution than many judges experienced in years. The bruises on his face had faded, but the impact of the assault remained, not as trauma, but as purpose. Marcus had realized that his position offered him a unique opportunity to address problems that had festered for decades, protected by a culture of silence and institutional inertia. In the weeks since the committee's decision, Marcus had methodically implemented changes within his sphere of authority. He had established new security protocol requirements that mandated consistent treatment of all courthouse visitors with detailed documentation of any secondary screening and regular audits to ensure compliance. He had initiated mandatory anti-bias training for all courthouse staff, bringing in experts from the Justice Department's Community Relations Service rather than using the security company that had previously provided such training. Most significantly, he had created a community oversight board to review courthouse security practices and handle complaints, including representatives from local bar associations, civil rights organizations, and community groups. The resistance to these initiatives had been substantial but not insurmountable. Some judges had objected to what they characterized as overreaching by a new colleague, but Chief Judge Reynolds, perhaps influenced by the Attorney General's involvement, had ultimately supported the changes. Desiree Jackson had been reinstated to her position with back pay and an apology after Marcus had personally advocated for her, citing whistleblower protections and threatening legal action if the retaliation continued. She had subsequently been promoted to a newly created position overseeing compliance with the new security protocols, her law school thesis on discriminatory practices in court systems having proven unexpectedly relevant to her career. The broader investigation had already yielded results beyond Brennan himself. 2 senior administrators implicated in covering up previous complaints had resigned rather than face scrutiny. Judge Sullivan had suddenly announced his early retirement, citing health concerns that few believed were genuine given the timing. The governor, sensing a shifting political landscape, had distanced himself from the controversy, issuing a statement supporting a thorough review of all procedures to ensure equal justice under law. Marcus had no illusions about the governor's sincerity, but the public statement made it harder for others to openly oppose the reforms. On a personal level, the intimidation campaign against Marcus and his family had largely subsided as the perpetrators realized he would not be easily cowed. The vandalism incidents had stopped after security cameras were installed at their home, and Jamal had not been pulled over again since Marcus had filed a formal complaint with the police department's Internal Affairs Division, complete with documentation of the pattern of stops. Tanya had found a position at a different hospital that actually offered better advancement opportunities, turning what had been intended as punishment into an unexpected benefit. That morning, Marcus had presided over a high-profile civil rights case involving allegations of police misconduct. The case had been one of those mysteriously reassigned away from him in the early days of the resistance, but it had found its way back to his docket after Judge Sullivan's retirement necessitated a redistribution of cases. Marcus had approached the matter with scrupulous fairness, allowing both sides to present their evidence fully and ruling based strictly on the applicable law rather than any personal bias. His handling of the case, which resulted in a split decision that held the individual officer accountable while acknowledging the department's subsequent policy improvements, had earned grudging respect from colleagues who had initially viewed him with suspicion. A knock at his chamber door interrupted his reflections. His clerk Kevin entered, his manner notably more respectful than in the early days of their working relationship. Judge Wilson, the Attorney General's investigative team, has requested access to the security archives from 2019 to present. They need your authorization since some of the materials are under judicial seal." Marcus signed the authorization without hesitation. Has there been any update on the Brennan civil rights case? After his termination, Brennan had found work as a private security guard at a shopping center, a significant step down from his courthouse position, but not the meaningful accountability that his actions deserved. 2 weeks earlier, however, the Justice Department had filed civil rights charges against him based on the pattern of discriminatory conduct documented in the Attorney General's investigation. Kevin nodded. "It's been assigned to Judge Ramirez in the Eastern District. Initial motions are scheduled for next month." Marcus felt a sense of satisfaction at the news. He had properly recused himself from any involvement in Brennan's case, but he would follow its progress with interest. The fact that it had been assigned to Judge Ramirez, a no-nonsense jurist known for her strict adherence to constitutional principles, suggested that justice might finally be served. Later that afternoon, as Marcus walked through the courthouse lobby on his way to a meeting, he paused to observe the security checkpoint. The changes were subtle but significant. Officers treating all visitors with consistent respect, clear signage explaining security procedures in multiple languages, a visible comment box for feedback, and most importantly, a diverse team of officers that better reflected the community the court served. As he watched a young black attorney approach the checkpoint was processed efficiently and respectfully, and continued on his way without the additional scrutiny that had once been routine. The small moment of normalcy, of equality, felt like a victory. In his office, awaiting his return, was a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from a first-year law student at Georgia State, a young black woman who wrote that she had been inspired by Marcus's story to pursue a judicial career. "Seeing someone stand up to systemic racism within the very institutions meant to protect justice gives me hope that change is possible," she had written. "I hope to clerk for a judge like you someday and perhaps eventually follow in your footsteps to the bench." Marcus had placed the letter on his desk beside a photograph of Judge Howard Thompson, his mentor, who had faced similar challenges decades earlier. The continuity across generations, the passing of both burden and hope, reminded him that progress wasn't linear, but cumulative, built on the courage of those who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. 1 year to the day after the assault, Marcus gave the keynote address at a judicial conference on ethics and accountability. Looking out at the audience of judges, attorneys, and court administrators from across the country, he spoke not about his personal experience, but about the structural challenges facing the justice system and the responsibility of each person in that room to address them. "Justice is not simply a verdict or a ruling," he concluded. "It's a practice, a commitment renewed daily through our actions and choices. The true test of our system is not how it treats the powerful and privileged, but how it serves those who have historically been denied its protections. That work belongs to all of us, regardless of our title or position." As he stepped away from the podium to applause, Marcus caught sight of Eliza Washington in the audience, nodding her approval. They had become not just colleagues, but allies in the continuing effort to transform the courthouse culture. The work was far from complete. Institutional change rarely happened quickly or without resistance, but the foundation had been laid for something better than what had come before. That evening, returning to his chambers to collect his things before heading home, Marcus found a news alert on his phone. The Justice Department had expanded its investigation to include 3 other federal courthouses where similar patterns of discrimination had been identified. The ripples from what had happened in Atlanta were spreading outward, creating the possibility of broader systemic change. Looking around his office, at the law books, the case files, the framed oath of office he had taken just 1 year earlier, Marcus felt a sense of purpose that transcended the personal injury that had marked the beginning of his judicial career. What had started as a broken nose had become a broken system, exposed with the first fragile shoots of reform beginning to emerge from the cracks. It wasn't justice in its complete form. That remained a distant ideal. But it was movement in the right direction, propelled by the courage of individuals who had refused to accept the status quo. As Marcus gathered his belongings and turned off the lights in his chambers, he thought about all the people who entered the courthouse each day seeking justice, many of them facing barriers invisible to those who had never experienced discrimination. His position gave him the power to address some of those barriers to make the path a little more equitable for those who would follow. It wasn't the role he had initially envisioned for his judgeship, but it was the one that history and circumstance had assigned him. And despite the challenges, despite the resistance that still remained, Marcus Wilson was ready to continue the work of bending the long arc of the moral universe a few degrees closer to justice. Do you believe one person with courage and conviction can truly change an entrenched system, or does meaningful change require collective action? Comment below with your thoughts on Judge Wilson's approach to fighting discrimination. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who care about justice and equality. Thank you for joining us for this powerful journey. And remember, sometimes the most important battles are fought not on the streets, but within the very institutions that are supposed to protect our rights. This powerful story illustrates how systemic racism persists within our institutions and the courage required to dismantle it. Judge Marcus Wilson's journey shows that true change demands more than individual resilience. It requires strategic documentation, building alliances, and leveraging institutional power. His approach teaches us that confronting discrimination isn't about immediate retribution, but creating lasting systemic transformation. By refusing to accept the status quo, he turned a personal attack into a catalyst for institutional reform. The story demonstrates how entrenched systems protect themselves through intimidation, retaliation, and narrative manipulation, while highlighting that meaningful change rarely comes quickly or without resistance. Wilson's effectiveness came from combining moral courage with legal expertise and strategic thinking. His character reminds us that justice work requires both personal dignity and tactical wisdom. Perhaps most importantly, this story emphasizes that positions of authority carry responsibility, not just to avoid perpetuating harm, but to actively create more equitable systems. Wilson understood that his role wasn't simply to judge cases, but to ensure the institution itself embodied the justice it claimed to deliver. His legacy became not just the cases he decided, but how he transformed the system that had once broken his nose. What would you do if faced with systemic discrimination in an institution meant to uphold justice? Would you fight from within, like Judge Wilson? Or would you pursue change through different channels? Comment below with your thoughts on the most effective strategies for combating institutional racism. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help others find it and subscribe for more powerful narratives about courage in the face of injustice. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how discrimination operates within systems, not just through individual actions. Thank you for bearing witness to Judge Wilson's journey. May his example inspire us all to use whatever power and position we have to create more just spaces for everyone. Remember, sometimes the most meaningful change begins with refusing to accept what others call just the way things are.